Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Actsafe Safety Association webinar on occupational first aid regulation changes with WorkSafeBC. So our intention today is to create a safe space for exchanging knowledge and supporting each other in solidarity. And we welcome questions throughout this afternoon's workshop. We're going to leave time at the end for a question and answer period. So Actsafe Safety Association would like to acknowledge and honor that our workplace and classrooms are located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Kaydee, Stalo, Hokiman, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Chemainus peoples. And if you'd like to learn more, you can go to native-land.ca. So a little bit of housekeeping. This session is approximately 60 minutes, allowing time for open conversations and a Q&A period to follow. All participants are muted. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature to submit your questions. And for your convenience, the closed captioning function is available for this webinar. Simply click Settings, then Accessibility tab under Closed Captioning. Click the checkbox to enable. If you have any issues, please advise our team in the chat room. And a recording of this webinar will be available on our website. A link will be emailed to you within a week after the webinar. So some learning objectives. By the end of this webinar, you are going to be aware of the OH&S regulations changes for occupational first aid in BC's workplaces, and this is effective November 1st. Any changes pertaining to remote and accessible work areas, first aid basic, intermediate, and advanced training content and requirements. Employers need to conduct first aid assessments to establish their workplace first aid requirements. First aid certification at recertification according to regulation changes. That first aid kits are now going to be aligned with CSA standards, and employers need to test their first aid drills and procedures. So a little bit about our presenters. And myself, Marett Alexander, I'm also an Actsafe safety advisor. I have served as head of health and safety for various film departments. I have a bachelor's degree in arts and have recently completed my certification in OH&S. And I'm now working towards my CRSP designation. We're also welcoming Deesha Jaswal, who's an OH&S consultant with WorkSafeBC. And she's been a safety consultant for about 14 years. She started off in healthcare and is now applying her expertise to motion pictures and live performance industries. She has also recently completed her MBA. And Kaydee Mohl, who's a manager with ProSafe training, and she's been in the health and safety industry for about 10 years. She currently manages ProSafe's Vancouver, Port Coquitlam, Burnaby, and Richmond campuses. And she's been an OH&S Level 3 ticket holder and a licensed emergency medical responder for many years. And she currently teaches all levels of OFA and Red Cross. So she's an instructor trainer with the Red Cross and is currently completing her provincial instructor diploma. A little bit about Actsafe. We are a not-for-profit health and safety association who support British Columbia's arts and entertainment industries. And we've been around since 98, sorry. We've been serving our industries by providing resources and training to employers, workers, and supervisors. And this is to achieve a healthy and safe workplace. We provide information relevant to best practices around health and safety for people in British Columbia. So our vision is to have the safest and healthiest arts and entertainment workplace in the world. And our mission is to prevent and eliminate workplace injury, illness, and death by providing world-class occupational health and safety well-being programs to employers, supervisors, and workers in the BC arts and entertainment industry. And our core values are safety, education, accessibility, collaboration, and innovation. So in April of 2023, the board directors of WorkSafeBC approved amendments to Part 3 of the regulation. These changes were slated to take effect November 1st of this year. So the time lag from April to November was intentionally designed to give employers and training providers ample time to prepare for the forthcoming adjustments. These amendments are applicable to all industries and workplaces in BC. Some key changes that are especially pertinent for work sites that are remote or have significant barriers when administering first aid. Even workplaces that are currently in compliance with existing regulations might observe minor alterations. So why the need for these changes? The first aid requirements have been largely unchanged for nearly 2 decades. Over this time, minimal changes were made. Several factors contributed to the decision to amend these regulations. One significant reason was that employers often defaulted to perceived requirements without considering specific workplace hazards. This underscored the necessity for a more robust first aid assessment framework that goes beyond the basic first aid requirements. Investigations, both employer-submitted and those conducted by WorkSafeBC, identified gaps and deficiencies in first aid services and emergency transportation, particularly for injured workers in remote locations and at work sites with considerable barriers to first aid. Another contributing factor was the implementation of national standards across Canada. Previously, first aid regulations were legislated provincially, and this caused confusion for companies operating across multiple provinces with interprovincial employees. So this confusion was the driving force behind the push for unified standard of first aid across Canada. The Canadian Standards Association, CSA, has 2 key standards: CSA Z1210-17 for first aid training, and CSA Z1220-17 for first aid kit requirements. These standards have been adopted in most Canadian provinces, with British Columbia joining a bit later than some others. Harmonizing with these 2 CSA standards is intended to facilitate labor mobility, allowing qualified workers from other provinces to use their first aid certificates in BC. In today's presentation, I will introduce some new concepts. First, we have workplace class. This was designed to enhance the transportation and equipment needs for remote and less accessible workplaces or work locations. Next, there is the first aid assessment process, which now includes a 2-part duty for employers: documenting as part of due diligence and involving your joint health and safety committee members or designated worker representatives in preparing, reviewing, and updating assessments. Additionally, the regulation now mandates annual first aid drills, a requirement previously in the guidelines, but now incorporated into the regulation. Finally, the new alignment with CSA standards has updated the naming conventions for first aid certifications. So let's start with the concept of workplace classification and its impact on the first aid assessment process. The minimum requirements for first aid are now outlined in 4 separate tables. To determine which table applies to your workplace, you'll need to assess the type of environment and its specific needs. First, let's define what qualifies as a remote workplace. A remote workplace is one where, under normal travel conditions, an ambulance that is a motor vehicle cannot travel from its base within 30 minutes or less. Normal travel conditions refer to the average time it takes for a vehicle to drive to and from the nearest ambulance station, adhering to road rules during regular working hours. So not ambulance speed, but regular car speed. So the relevant distance is from the ambulance station to your workplace, not from your workplace to nearest hospital. If your site is more than 30 minutes away from an ambulance station under normal driving conditions, it is classified as remote. And we will provide a link in the chat to a map of the nearest ambulance station for your reference. You can also search for BCHS ambulance station online to find a map. Another important classification is less accessible. So this term applies to workplaces that are difficult for ambulances to reach by land or where ambulance attendants cannot safely access your site. If you have any questions about which classification applies to your workplace, please refer to the provided map or consult the resources linked in the chat. So let's talk about less accessible workplaces. Work sites that cannot be reached by a land ambulance or where ambulance attendants may not safely access injured workers are considered inaccessible. BCHS will generally not access in the following areas: backcountry, only accessible by ATV or snowmobile; steep slopes, private industrial roads, areas with potential avalanches or landslides. An example of this could be if you're working on a steep road in the mountains that's only gravel. Additionally, BCHS will not rescue injured workers from hazardous work areas like confined spaces, underground workings, excavations, areas requiring specialized PPE or with potential hazardous atmosphere. For example, if you use carbon monoxide from equipment that's commonly used in our industry, or ammonia that gets used in skating rinks. An exclusion to this would be if the location is not remote and the employer has developed alternative rescue provisions, it might not be considered less accessible. So example of this would be a film shoot on the Lower Mainland working up at Cypress Mountain. So we'll say for our purposes that this is 15 minutes from an ambulance station, but the workers are working in an area that's accessible only via a very steep gravel path. So if the film shoot has procedures in place where they fall within this 30-minute window, it falls under the exclusion despite being a less accessible area. So a recommendation could be if your work site has hazardous areas and you're unsure if it's less accessible, please reach out to Actsafe or your local prevention officer. When determining your workplace class, keep the definitions of remote and less accessible in your mind. In the Lower Mainland, most film, performing arts, and live events fall within this 30-minute time frame. So according to this table, this means they are not remote. If they are also not less accessible, when we're looking at Schedule 3A, they would be Class 1. So you would refer to Table 3-1 for these workplaces. If they're greater than 30 minutes and less accessible, then they would be Class 4, and you would refer to Table 3-4. These reference tables let you know what kind of first aid attendants you need, how many first aid attendants you need, the supplies needed, and if needed, emergency transportation requirements, a dressing station, and a first aid room. So this regulation introduces a two-part duty for employers during the first aid assessment. Part 1 determines the first aid regulations. Assess the minimum level of first aid needed based on workplace class, number of workers, and hazard rating. In Part 2, the employer needs to consider additional needs. Evaluate if there are any unique hazards or barriers at your workplace requiring extra equipment or supplies. For example, if a specific chemical requires special first aid treatment, this must be accounted for. Or if you have people working on a tension grid in a theater, do you have the equipment necessary to rescue that worker? These are key responsibilities now required in your first aid assessment. So we're going to review the new first aid assessment worksheet, which became available in July on WorkSafeBC sites. You can access the new template via the link we'll share in the chat. Actsafe will also be launching a new online version of the first aid assessment tool, and this will be live for the November 1st launch. So for now, we're going to use this PDF worksheet. The first part involves filling out the employer's information. including the names of the consulted workers and the Joint Health and Safety Committee members, as worker involvement is now required. I'd like to mention here that this is not the same thing as a location hazard assessment. There's been some confusion about that from our stakeholders who think that they're already doing this step. So steps to complete this worksheet. Number 1, determine the number of workers. Include your managers, supervisors, administrative staff, and anyone regularly accessing this workplace. Separate assessments may be required for different shifts. The guideline offers direction for calculating workers across multiple sites. This multiple sites applies when workers are doing similar tasks at different locations throughout the day. An example of this would be drivers. Step 2, determine your hazard rating. You can use the QR code on the worksheet to access the document listing industries and their hazard ratings, which are low, moderate, or high. And this rating assigned by WorkSafeBC is based on claim statistics and common hazards for your industry. You can also find this rating on your annual assessment rate letter or by using the tool on the WorkSafeBC website. Part 3, exceptions. Administrative workplaces with lower hazard ratings, for example, the office. Multiple workplaces with different hazard ratings at various stages. CUs not assigned a hazard rating, or workplaces where tasks align better with a different CU. So for exceptions, ensure your decision is justified in the assessment and involves consultation. If you use an alternative CU, it must not be used to reduce your hazard rating inappropriately. The next step in the first aid assessment is determining your workplace class based on the definitions of remote and less accessible. Let's use a performing arts venue with a tension grid as an example. If the venue is 9 minutes away from an ambulance station, it's not considered remote because it's under 30 minutes. This would fit under Group 1. However, because workers are working on tension grid, you check off other hazardous areas not accessible to BC EHS attendance, and you describe the issues on the assessment. For the purpose of this assessment, we'll state that you have a rescue procedure in place and you're able to get that worker off the tension grid so it falls within the 30-minute time frame. At the bottom of the assessment sheet, you identify any exceptions. So this workplace is not remote and all applicable conditions, i.e. the rescue procedures, are met. It's not considered less accessible. Therefore, this workplace is classified as Workplace Class 1. You would click off alternative provisions are in place to safely rescue workers from the hazardous areas to an area inaccessible by BC EHS. Now, if that same performing arts venue is 40 minutes away from an ambulance station, it would be classified as remote, as 40 minutes exceeds the 30-minute threshold. The conditions remain the same. So other hazardous areas not accessible to BC EHS attendance is still checked. However, because it's now remote, it doesn't meet the exception criteria and is therefore also considered less accessible. This changes the classification to Workplace Class 4, and you would reference Table 3-4 for further guidance. When completing the first aid assessment, if the workplace is 9 minutes from an ambulance station, it's classified as Class 1. There's a QR code that links to the relevant tables. For 22 workers with a moderate risk rating, you'll need to refer to column 3. This column outlines the minimum first aid requirements, which includes an intermediate first aid kit, a dressing station, and 1 intermediate first aid attendant. Since no emergency transportation is needed in this case, that requirement is not included. This is the first part of your employer's duty, determining the minimum first aid requirements. The next page of the first aid assessment guides you through the second part of the employer's 2-part duty. Here, You'll determine what is unique to your workplace, location, and processes that may impact first aid provisions. You'll need to assess risks and hazards specific to your organization. For example, consider if you use any chemicals requiring special first aid measures, or review your past injuries and near misses. Also, evaluate any physical, communication, or cultural barriers, especially if you interact with the public or require emergency transportation. In this section, you'll list any additional first aid requirements beyond the minimum. So, for example, if you were using fire as part of your scene you were shooting, or as part of your performing arts or live entertainment presentation, you would need to add cooling packs, burn dressings, and hydrogel to your first aid kit. If you decide to have an AED, you would also list it here under additional equipment. Another situation you could encounter, especially in performing arts or live entertainment, is where first aid attendants are expected to treat members of the public. The employer would have to ensure that the number of first aid attendants and procedures are sufficient to provide treatment to workers without undue delay. Consider if you have a workplace that is large and it takes more than 10 minutes walking time to reach all areas of the workplace. The employer would have to consider the number and distribution of first aid attendants and equipment to ensure timely response to all areas of the workplace. Another thing to consider is if there are known barriers that might affect BC EHS response time, such as train crossings, lift bridges, temporary road closures, construction zones. If you're working remotely, things to consider are hours of hospital operation, doctor availability, hospital diversion protocols, or routine closures of BC EHS stations. These factors might be temporary or permanent, but if they're known or reasonably foreseeable, they should be factored into the employer's risk assessment. This is also where you're going to list your emergency transportation if you're using it. This could range from an ETV to a helicopter. Okay, we're going to talk about involving workers in your first aid assessments. So starting in November, first aid assessments must be documented, and you must involve your Joint Health and Safety Committee or designated worker representative in preparing, reviewing, and updating them. These assessments must be reviewed and updated at least annually or when significant changes occur. Smaller workplaces without a Joint Health and Safety Committee or designated representative are also required to involve workers in this process. So this can be done during safety meetings or toolbox talks. And the reason for this amendment is that workers are in the best position to inform the employer of the hazards and risks associated with their tasks. Their involvement is crucial to the success of your first aid program and overall safety management system. The guideline includes a list of procedures that may be required in your workplace. While these procedures are already covered in the current guidelines, the new preliminary guidelines offer a more detailed guidance on what's expected. Essentially, nothing has changed, just clearer expectations. Workers and attendants must be trained in the relevant first aid procedures, and these should also be part of your worker orientation. For example, workers should know how to summon first aid, the location of first aid facilities, and how to get first aid during an evacuation. First aid procedures should be printed and posted throughout the workplace, including in lunchrooms and other common areas. They should also be made available on the company intranet, shared drive, printed copies, vehicles, cell phones, or mobile apps, whatever works best for your workplace. It's crucial to involve workers in choosing the communication methods that work best, which might be a combination of several methods. We can talk about drills now. Drills are crucial for ensuring the effectiveness of your first aid procedures, even though they require time and preparation. They serve as both a test of your procedure and a valuable training tool for everyone involved. During drills, assess whether you can access equipment, supplies, and first aid facilities without any issues. Ensure workers are familiar with the procedures, know the location of the equipment, and can summon and respond to the first aid needs effectively. If you have multiple attendants, and evaluate how well they coordinate. Check for any unforeseen barriers to accessing, assessing, moving, and transporting an injured worker. After each drill, you're going to want to identify any gaps or deficiencies and collaborate with workers and attendants to find solutions. This ensures everyone understands their roles and are committed to effective first aid services. Drills should be conducted promptly after implementation of new procedures, or at least annually, or when significant changes occur, such as new transportation methods or communication systems. Examples of this would include required transportation methods. For example, you go from a taxi to emergency transport vehicle. In the way a first aid attendant is summoned. In the workplace class, you go from class 2 remote to class 3 less accessible. To the level of first aid certification needed, you go from basic to advanced. To rescue procedures that affect first aid procedures. We're going to talk about worker safety during drills. Drills should not be designed in such a way that they do not, well, they should be designed in such a way that they do not pose an undue hazard to workers or the public and first aid attendants participating in the drill. If a drill of a particular first aid procedure poses an undue hazard to workers or others, a tabletop exercise may be used to supplement drill activities if it will allow for an effective evaluation of the employer's procedures. Employers must maintain drill records for due diligence. However, BCHS should not be contacted for conducting drills. You can incorporate 911 procedures into your drills, as many people are unfamiliar with what to expect. Just ensure that drills do not pose undue hazards. Use tabletop exercises if necessary. Finally, share your drill results with your Joint Health and Safety Committee or designated worker representative. Actsafe is creating a first aid drill resource and a first aid drill template that you can use for your drills, and these will be available soon. So when do you need to use an emergency transport vehicle? Your production will need to have an ATV if any of the following are true. You have a low hazard rating, a remote work location, which is more than 30 minutes from an ambulance station, and 50 or more workers. You have a moderate hazard rating, a remote work location, and 10 or more workers. Or you have a high hazard rating, a remote work location, and 6 or more workers. Types of emergency vehicles that can be used. Emergency transport vehicle, an ETV, industrial ambulance, mobile treatment center, BC Emergency Health Services ambulance, or a helicopter. If air transportation is the only reasonable way to access the work location, the production must arrange for emergency air transportation for seriously injured workers. You should also plan on using air transportation as a primary method if the surface travel time to hospital is more than 2 hours. So the requirements of your ETV. An ETV must be capable of safely transporting a first aid attendant and the injured worker with a stretcher used to secure the worker. ETVs must have an effective means of communication. So it must have effective voice communication between the operator and the attendant in the treatment area of the vehicle. It should have a means of effective communication with the scene of the accident, and it should have effective communication with the hospital. And Actsafe will have a resource for emergency transport vehicles that will be available by November 1st. So first, quick updates on the first aid kit requirements. These are changing based on CSA Z1220. Detailed kit contents are now available in the preliminary guidelines. Employers should transition these to new contents that as they purchase new kits or replace supplies. You don't need to discard your OFA kits, but you must acquire supplemental items to comply with the CSA standards. If you're buying a new CSA kit, ensure it's labeled as medium to meet compliance requirements. Some suppliers offer type 2 and type 3 kits marked as small, but you need the medium size. Changes to emergency transport vehicle equipment, first aid room equipment, and dressing station equipment are mostly minor. This is focusing on terminology and the inclusion of new materials in the kits. For example, the number of splints required in the first aid room has decreased since they're now included in the CSA kit. So now is the perfect time to review your first aid room or dressing station inventory. You might already have the necessary supplies, so a thorough check can help avoid unnecessary purchases. So I included this slide because it conveniently summarizes the changes from the old OFA kits to the new CSA kits. There's no requirements to dispose of your existing first aid supplies. These changes are mostly minor. For example, the basic kit now includes a few extra adhesive bandages, a pressure dressing, and hand cleansing towelettes. You might already have these items in your first aid room or dressing station, so now's a great time to check your inventory and see what you actually need. And I'm going to turn this now over to Kaydee.
Thank you. So as we have noted, the CSA standards are across Canada, and this was a question that was coming up quite often with students in classrooms. And these changes were implemented to standardize training across the country so that people who want to work in different provinces do not have to repeat their training, but each province may have something that they have to do to come up to current legislation, such as a jurisprudence package. And all new course updates were implemented in BC as of September 1st of this year. Next slide, please. So what is changing? Some things have changed a lot and some things have kind of stayed the same. So program names have changed, durations of some of the courses, some evaluations, some skills or knowledge have changed with this update. The biggest thing we're seeing are the names for people trying to wrap their heads around them. So Occupational First Aid Basic was formerly our Occupational First Aid Level 1. Occupational First Aid Intermediate was formerly the Occupational First Aid Level 2. And Occupational First Aid Advanced was formerly the Occupational First Aid Level 3. And so the training started in September 1st of this year. And as of November 1st, organizations must follow the new OH&S guidelines, but tickets are still valid. So if you currently have a Level 2 ticket, it is still valid. You would just recertify when your ticket comes to the expiration. Next slide, please. So the durations of the courses have changed in some aspects. So the OFA Basic, which was the Level 1, remains a 1-day, 8-hour course. The OFA Intermediate is the biggest change in terms of going from 5 days down to a 2-day, 16-hour course. And the OFA Advanced remains a 10-day, 80-hour course. So the 1 and the 3, the Basic and the Advanced, have stayed very, very similar. The Level 2 or the Intermediate is the biggest change that we're seeing. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the changes in the courses, the Intermediate is the one that has seen the biggest changes. The OFA Basic, there's very little change. They do reference some things like a secondary assessment, but the skills, the knowledge is very, very similar. The exam, the questions have changed, but it's still the same amount of questions that they answered before. The OFA Intermediate has had the biggest changes in the fact that there is no pre-reading required. There's no longer any quizzes or homework. There's no practical scenarios at the end for a formal evaluation. Everything is evaluated during the course in terms of skills, and they just have the written at the end of the course. It does now include 2 rescue or CPR, critical incident stress, disease transmission, and prevention. And then the OFA Advanced, we have seen some changes, but they are reviewing the final documentation now. It's still in draft form. It's very similar, but there will be some curriculum changes. And as of right now, the OFA transportation endorsement, or the TE, has had no changes. Next slide, please. So for equivalencies, we are seeing some updates to the website currently. We know that the Red Cross emergency first aid and standard first aid has now been approved to be equivalent to the basic first aid. We are hoping that we will also see the standard first aid be considered equivalent to the intermediate. We expect that's what's going to be happening. We hope that's what's going to be happening, but that has not been updated as of yet. We also have seen some indications that the advanced first aid from the Red Cross will be equivalent as well to the occupational first aid advanced in the future. But again, we're just waiting on those changes, and hopefully we will be seeing them soon. We are checking the website every single day so that we can update as soon as any updates come forward. And I'm going to pass it back to you, Marett.
Thank you, Kaydee. So the updated guidelines introduce new requirements and clarifications. Retired sections have been incorporated elsewhere, such as AEDs, which are now part of the first aid assessment under equipment considerations. EDI, which is ethnicity, diversity, and inclusion, are now part of the updated guidelines. Examples of this would include offering PPE in various sizes, like gloves and harnesses, or ensuring accessibility by providing signage and procedures in languages suited to the workforce. Worker engagement is also emphasized, with procedures for gathering feedback and improving the first aid program. More details are available in the BC Office of the Human Rights Commissioner's Employment Equity Toolkit, and there's a link for that in the chat. Lastly, you must ensure that workers are trained on these first aid procedures. This is a requirement for the new worker orientation. So, key considerations. The preliminary guidelines were posted in June, and I've been told that the final version will have some changes, but at this moment, we don't know what they are. Certificates expiring between July 2nd and October 30th will receive an extension. First aid kits don't need to be replaced, only purchase missing equipment. Review and update your first aid program and procedures now. For questions or further assistance, please contact the team at Actsafe or your local prevention officer. So that concludes our presentation. We will now go on to the question and answer period. So we have some questions. The first one, and Deesha Jaswal from WorkSafeBC will be answering these questions. So Deesha, regarding substantive changes, if you were filming in the bush remotely one day where you'd need a higher level of procedures, and the next day filming in a house in town, would you need to do a first aid drill for the house as well as for the bush? Just to be clear, you're going from a class 3 to or 4 to a class 2, not class 2 to 3 or 4.
Thank you, Marett, for the question. An important thing to remember is that drills are tied to procedures, but the guidelines also talk about what constitutes a substantiative change. So for example, for the film industry, they will likely have to develop 4 sets of procedures, 1 for each class workplace. So assuming these 4 sets of procedures are pretty much the same, except for the location of the nearest ambulance station and the directions to the hospital, then they would need to conduct 4 drills over the course of the year, 1 for each set of procedures. They may not need to conduct a drill at each workplace unless they add in any special rescue equipment or modes of transport for particularly less accessible filming locations.
Hey, Deesha. Next question is, for shows that last only 3 weeks, what would they be looking for drills? Is this a must or a should regarding drills? What is the expectation for drills?
So again, drills are based on procedures, and if the procedures are the same between all the locations, you do not have to have a drill at each location. It'd be 1 drill annually.
Thank you. Next question. How long can a production company film in BC before they need to conduct a drill?
So drills are required at each location annually, and whenever procedures do change. So you would be able to refer to section 3.17, section 4 for clarification. As for the expectations of when to conduct drills, the guideline states as soon as practicable. Having stated this, we are hopeful that employers and officers would take more of a risk-based approach. If the workplace, for example, is a class 4 workplace, so remote and less accessible, that would require some special transport procedures to get injured workers into the care of BC Ambulance. We would then hope that they would ensure that their procedures are effective sooner rather than later. So there's no hard or fast rule here.
Okay. Who needs to be involved in the first aid drill? The whole workplace or just the key players?
So there are no specifications at the moment. However, individuals involved would be the key players. So key players such as the first aid attendant, workers involved, any joint health committee members, as they're going to be reviewing the outcome of the drills. So it would be the key players.
What procedures and processes should be assessed during the first aid drills?
A first aid drill should include mock scenarios that support the evaluation and effectiveness of procedures. If the workplace requires first aid equipment and procedures that exceed the minimum requirements of Schedule 3A, those procedures should be incorporated into the annual drills. Drills should also be conducted when there's a substantiative change to written first aid procedures. So it's important to remember that BC Ambulance, when conducting a drill, shouldn't be contacted for the purpose of conducting first aid drills, but specific procedures and processes that should be assessed during first aid drills would include the ability for first aid attendants or other workers to access equipment, supplies, and first aid facilities. For workers to be familiar with how to call first aid and the location of the first aid equipment, how effectively the first aid attendants can be summoned and respond to both minor and serious injuries, how effectively an injured worker can be accessed and moved if there are any barriers present in the workplace, how effectively an injured worker can be prepared and transported to an area accessible to BC Ambulance if required, and whether first aid attendants are familiar with documentation and reporting requirements. And a first aid drill should also include mock scenarios that support the evaluation and effectiveness of procedures listed above.
Does the safety meeting and reviewing first aid procedures count as a drill?
So safety meetings, so basic answer is no. Safety meetings and reviewing first aid procedures do not count as drills. A first aid drill should include mock scenarios that support the evaluation and the effectiveness of the actual procedures.
For film and TV shows, there are often individuals traveling from BC to Alberta and other provinces. Do they conduct drills and assessments in Alberta and other provinces as well?
So if a production company is actively operating in British Columbia, they are required to register with WorkSafeBC as employers. Therefore, when filming in BC, the production company would be expected to follow WorkSafeBC regulations. And I can actually put the link of the webpage where there's more information about registration as well. But at this time, Alberta or any other provinces, they do not require any specific drills for first aid.
Okay, do we need to document the drill? And if so, how?
So employers would need to document drills, and they should maintain drill records to establish compliance with the requirements of section 3.17, section 4. Drill records should contain the following information. So the date and the time of the drill, the names and roles of participants, a brief summary of the scenario tested, a summary of observation and outcomes, including any deficiencies outlined, any corrective actions taken revision into the OH&S guidelines part 3. And if there's any significant deficiencies observed, or if the drill cannot be conducted as intended, employers should address any deficiencies and perform the drill again if procedures change significantly.
If there are 20 temporary movie shoots in a span of 30 days, would we be required to conduct a first aid assessment at each location?
So the first aid assessment is not a risk assessment. Guidelines have a task-based assessment where all the risk factors in the location are the same. The employer can choose to do one first aid assessment, but given the location and risk factors, the location and risk factors must be the same for these. Additionally, if you're wondering more about drills are based on procedures, and if the procedures are the same between all locations, you do not have to do a drill at each location. It'd be one drill annually.
Okay, do you have to have a first aid level 1 through 3 to get a transportation endorsement? Do Teamsters drivers have to have a transportation endorsement to drive someone to seek medical aid?
So the basic and intermediate first aid attendants, they would require their courses in order to obtain transportation endorsement. So you can refer to section 3.24 for more information, and I can put that into the chat as well. As to what types of courses are needed, it depends on their classes, but no, in short, drivers do not need a transportation endorsement. They're the drivers and they're not first aid attendants.
And what barriers may affect BC EHS response time?
So barriers that could possibly affect BC ambulance response time would be such as train crossing, for example, train crossings, lift bridges, temporary road closure, construction zones, or hospital diversions, the transportation to the hospital, road weather conditions, which may make the workplace inaccessible to BC ambulance. So these are examples of barriers, and when barriers are present or identified, the employer should take all reasonable measures to eliminate or otherwise minimize the impact of these barriers on the time it may take to transport a worker to medical treatment. Employers should also consider providing supplemental emergency transportation to safely transporting an injured worker to a hospital, or meeting BC ambulance en route and or a higher level of first aid attendant and equipment to better manage injuries while waiting for BC ambulance. First aid procedures should also be updated as well to consider these barriers. I know you mentioned that earlier in your presentation.
Yeah. Okay, so to confirm, there are 3 sections now: regular, location, remote, and less accessible.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Is there a clear document with number of workers on set and what is required?
There is. I can provide links to that as well. But another point I've had as well is I am working on a question and answer, or FAQ, for this industry. So that will be out shortly as well. So we can incorporate all these questions that we do have in the chat box, as well as any questions that have come in previously for the industry. And we can provide that shortly as well.
Thank you, Deesha. This might be for Kaydee. Can you clarify what certifications that attendants have will still be valid?
So if they currently have a valid first aid certificate, it is considered valid until the expiry date on the certificate. So whether it's a level 1, 2, or 3, unless their job site requires them to have something different.
Thank you, Kaydee. Another question for Deesha. Ambulances are only two-wheel drive and accessibility may not be there for snow or muddy roads, i.e. for mountains, etc., winter conditions. Please confirm.
Yes, so in that situation, the employer would need to be responsible for finding out an alternate method of finding emergency transportation.
And somebody wants to know, I don't know if this is a question we can answer, if industrial ambulances are able to transport to a hospital with sirens and lights.
I think that may be for BC Ambulance to answer. I believe they have different protocols as well.
Yeah. Okay, so somebody's asking, we provide production labor in an arena for concerts. We provide an OFA2 while overhead work is happening. The arena who contract us for providing the labor provide an OFA3. Do we need to do first aid drills, or is that the responsibility of the arena, which is the prime contractor?
So multi-employer workplaces, the prime contractor would be responsible for any drills, but I can actually send that out in the chat, the information of where you can find that in the guidelines as well.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, Marett, one more thing. Another note is the guidelines are continuously changing. So even at the moment, as we are speaking, they are changing. So before November 1st, you will find a lot more changes within the guidelines. And if anybody does have any suggestions for wordings or any questions about the actual regulations, I can put an email address. It's called RegPack Consult, and that's where they can provide any questions they have for regulations or any guidelines specifically.
Thank you. Is an employer required to provide first aid to an audience member?
Sorry, Marett, was that question for me?
Yes, just asking does an employer, are they required to provide first aid to audience members, so not a worker?
They are, I mean, if they are there if they do have their first aid, and if they can provide first aid services, otherwise it would be good humanitarian service.
Thank you. So somebody else asked, we are a live theater in BC and our work locations are all local. We do not have remote or inaccessible workplaces. Do we still need to do drills?
Yes, drills are required annually, regardless of whether they're inaccessible or if they are remote.
Okay. And somebody else asked, as for adding rescue systems to grids/loading galleries, is there a grace period for having these installed, or are we expected to be in compliance come November 1st?
That is a good question. I can take that back to the regulatory practice department, and I can get the answer for you because yes, the regulations and guidelines are coming up quite soon. So that would be good to know.
Somebody else asked, who leads the drills? First aid?
So we don't have any specifications as to who leads the drills, but as I mentioned earlier, the key players would be first aid attendants, joint health and occupational committee members, or any workers that are involved, such as drivers, etc.
Do you know if WorkSafeBC is looking at doing any kind of program with production similar to the PACE program, REJOHS, to help with incorporating these new regulations?
That is a good question. I am not aware of that at the moment, but I think that would be a great ask. So I can take that back. And as well as I know they are in the background working on resources for specific industries. So I can also mention this point as well, because I think that would be beneficial.
And to Shelley, who asked that question, you can always come to Actsafe as well, and we can see what we can help with. This would be totally depending on how much other work we have, but we would be happy to help you where we could. So please do reach out. Somebody's asking about first aid attendance. So this might be a question for Kaydee potentially. Are there any equivalencies related to quantity of attendance, specifically if two basic attendants are required, would one intermediate attendant be an equivalent, or perhaps one ADV is equivalent to two basic? Many in such cases, so equivalencies would be helpful, as many of our current first aid attendants hold OFA 3 tickets. That's probably a Deesha question.
That's a WorkSafe question.
Yeah.
Yes, I can look into that, Marett, and I can get back to you on that, and that way we can incorporate that into the FAQ as well. I would have to pull up the training requirements.
Thank you, Deesha. Psychological first aid attendants. The union covers first aid attendants. These are level 3 advanced ticket holders. Are they being trained in this now?
I am quite unsure about that question. Kaydee, do you know if you're training in this at all right now, or?
There will be critical incident stress in the courses, but there wouldn't be necessarily like a psychological first aid training designation in the courses, unless there's updates that we haven't seen yet. There are other courses that you can take for psychological first aid training, but not currently offered by WorkSafe.
Thank you, Kaydee. Can only one member of the Joint Health and Safety Committee complete the WorkSafe assessments, or is it expected that all Joint Health and Safety Committee members take part in all assessments?
There are no specifications at the moment. However, we do encourage all Joint Health and Committee members to take part in reviewing the assessment, so everyone is on board as to what is going on within the first aid requirements and assessments.
When BC Productions are filming in locations out of province, for example, Fortress Mountain in Alberta, do these regulations apply to BC workers, or would the Alberta regulations apply?
So if they are filming in Alberta, you would not be doing any drills. It would only be if you're actively operating in BC and you're registered here in WorkSafeBC as employers. These requirements would only affect you if you're filming within BC.
How will WorkSafe be ensuring employers will be following the new guidelines? Will there be an increase in site visits by WorkSafe to ensure compliance?
I'm not quite sure if there's going to be an increase, but we will be in contact with employers, and we'll be doing our best to work with them with adjusting to the new guidelines and regulations. But I can have a chat with the prevention officers and see what they're at and where they're thinking, and I can get back to you on that.
Thank you. Does an assessment need to be done for each location, or only one for each class type location, i.e. one assessment for every single house we film at, or just one house assessment that covers all houses?
For assessments, it would depend on the procedures. So if the procedures are the same between all locations, you could do one drill, but at the same time, you could do an assessment for each location.
If a production preps, shoots, and wraps in less than a year, are they required to conduct drills?
So drills, again, are based on procedures, and if the procedures are the same, then you would have to do one if they're the same between all locations, then you do not have to do a drill at each location. It would be one drill annually.
Okay. What happens when they change first aid attendants, pre-crews versus shooting crew? I'm guessing for drills, maybe? I'm not sure.
Sorry, I'm not understanding the question either.
So I guess I'm thinking this is to do with drills. What happens when or maybe it's for first aid assessments. What happens when they change first aid attendants, pre-crews versus shooting crews? I'm not sure that question maybe isn't fully fleshed out. We'll go on to the next one. Somebody would like to get a link to the section of the OH&S guidelines. We have a link, Kaylee, in our guidelines. We've put that up in the chat, and this will be coming out to you in the follow-up email. So if a level 3 person is required on locations and the show sends one from construction or another department and that department leaves, should the show actually supply a show level 3, not a department level 3, to make sure employees are covered the whole time?
Hi, Marett. Sorry, was that for me?
Yes, they're just wondering if there has to be a coverage for employees at all time. It's not really probably relevant to this.
Yes, you know what? I can send the link into the chat. I'm just looking it up right now.
I think everybody is so happy to have somebody from WorkSafe answer the questions. They're sending them out. Okay, next question for you, Deesha. When assessing the work site, do you include all people who come and go throughout the day as total count number of people for the site, and activities change throughout the day? High hazard of power tools, chainsaws, etc., telehandlers, pyrotechnics. Does the highest hazard rate dictate the hazard rating for the site of the day? As a primary contractor, does the production also cover third-party vendors such as Aardvark, Full Moon, Whites, etc.? And finally well, we've already answered this about the designated first aid attendants.
So the first, I think there's multiple questions within that question, but the first question is yes, anybody who is on set, anybody who is working, whether they're part-time or full-time, would be counted as an employee. And I believe the second question had to do with hazard rating, and were they asking if, there's a hazard rating change from?
Yeah,
okay.
if they're working at the highest hazard, I guess what people are a bit confused about with the hazards is because for movies, it's a moderate hazard, and for live events and performing arts, I believe it's a low hazard. So they're wondering if they would ever be at a higher hazard rating.
So that is a possibility, but where work is performed in a separate workplace, it's not generally considered work described in the employer's classification unit description. And if it poses a greater risk to workers, then a different hazard could be used. But however, if you're in the same location and you have, and say, for example, the classification unit describes supporting activities for motion pictures, let's say, and the supporting activities include administrative, construction, casting, it includes all of those, then we would utilize the assigned hazard rating as moderate. And I can put the link into the chat for you right now.
Okay.
So where you can find the hazard rating within your CU.
Thank you, Deesha. Somebody's wondering what is defined as key player in regards to the involvement in the drill.
The key player would be anybody who would be involved, such as a first aid attendant, any joint occupational health and safety members, as they will be looking over any assessments, reviewing the assessments, any workers who are involved, any drivers who are potentially involved as well.
Okay, somebody's wondering about the first aid room. That might be a requirement on some sets. Can a room in the honey wagon be designated as a room when you're on locations?
I believe that depends on how many employees are working, and it depends on the assessment as well, but I can definitely get back to you on that.
Thank you. Does a fire drill count as fulfilling the drill requirement?
No, a fire drill would be, it's not the same as conducting a first aid drill. A first aid drill would be a mock scenario of what you would do in a first aid scenario.
Do they have to run a drill on a 3-week production?
So drills are based on procedures again, and if the procedures are the same between all the locations, so say even if you have a set that lasts only 3 weeks, and the drill, if the procedures are the same between all your locations, all your filming locations, you do not have to conduct a drill at each location. It would be one drill annually.
I guess what they're trying to ask, Deesha, is they're saying they're only shooting 3 weeks. Do they actually need to do a drill?
Would it be under the same production company? Or would it
Let's say
just
it's
be,
a new production company?
if it's a new production company, I would say yes, they would have to, as long as, I mean, unless they are doing other movie shootings or other shows at the same time and they have the same procedures and nothing has changed.
Okay, thank you. Can a production double an emergency helicopter to serve also as a talent or executive transport to a remote location that requires an emergency helicopter?
I would definitely be able to get back to you on that. I would need to look that up.
Okay. If the first aid attendant are required to treat members of the public, are they included as employees? I think you answered that one a bit earlier, but.
Yes, yeah, it was the same question as
Yeah.
before.
Yeah. Can you please clarify the transportation note for low hazards in class 3 workplace? I'm not sure what that question is. Does that make sense to you, Deesha?
No, I think I
Okay.
would need more
Okay.
information.
If you have multiple first aid attendants for each of our venues, do we need to do a separate drill for each of those first aid attendants?
So no, if you do have multiple attendants, as long as the procedures do not change, you wouldn't need to do a separate drill for each venue or each place. It would be one drill annually.
If the first aid attendant eligible to be a worker representative in regards to signing off on first aid reports, or does it have to be another worker representative?
Sorry, Marett, could you repeat the
So
question again?
if the first aid attendant is eligible to be a worker representative in regards to signing off on first aid attendance, first aid reports, sorry, or does it have to be another worker representative? I think we're talking about the assessments, the worker involvement. So they're asking if the first aid attendant would be eligible.
That's a good question. I can take that back.
Thank you. Are first aid assessments required to be posted in each work site on the respective safety boards?
Yes, that is correct.
Somebody's looking for recommendation for mental health courses to support the film industry. Maybe you could put that in the chat, Dagan. If you know it, or will any courses for mental health be necessary in the near future? Somebody says, is an annual drill required within the first 364 days of a company's operation?
It is required as soon as practicable, but yes, within the first 364 days, correct. As soon as practicable.
Okay, so somebody thinks that the question wasn't answered fully, just to clarify. If a show is prepped, shot, and wrapped within 7 months, is it a requirement to have a drill? It's technically not a year.
So if it is, just for my clarity, would it be a show would it be a production company having put on a show just for that 7 months and it's a brand new company, or would it be a production company with multiple shows?
Let's say it's a standalone production company that doesn't have any other shows. I think
Yes.
the fact that it's just people are confused about the fact you say it has to be done yearly.
In a year, yes. No, I would say even if it was 7 months, I would say that they would need to have a drill.
Yeah. Even if it was 3 weeks, right? They would have to have, yeah.
And it was a brand new production company, brand new, yeah.
Yeah, because there's some, like say you're a performing arts venue that has the same kind of, everything's the same going on, but you have a show 1 month and then you're off 2 months and you have another show, it would be technically the same and you wouldn't probably need to have a drill for that, correct?
That's
Except
correct.
the first drill.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Somebody wants to know is, do stunts and power tools and telehandlers in construction increase the hazard rating to high? If you know.
Would this be for the film industry or for
Probably.
performing arts?
Yeah, let's say it'd be for film industry.
So if it's not included in the hazard rating for classification unit, then it would not. But if it's not and it is a separate location, then it would. So I'm gonna send a link out right now so then everyone can have a read. I can send that out right now.
Thank you, Deesha. For performing arts theater, not remote, 1,000+ capacity, what level first aid is required for the front of house services? And what are the dressing room requirements?
I think that would need more detail to answer because you would have to go through the assessment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I believe you have already answered this, but if a production company has more than one project going on at any one time under the same company, are they only required to do an annual drill on one of the shows?
If the procedures do not change, then you would require one annual drill. But if they do change, and let's say you do need rescue equipment or there's substantial changes in the environment, etc., or the remoteness, etc., so then that's when you would need multiple drills.
I told you there'd be a lot of questions about the drills. Okay, let's see. Would BC EHS be able to transport an individual from an attic space only accessible by ladder, or would we need to develop our own rescue procedures to transport the worker from the attic space down to the area where BC EHS can provide aid?
I believe you would need to, if it's classified as confined space, you would need to come up with your own procedures because BC Ambulance will not be going into confined spaces.
When you have low risk activities, office combined with high risk activities such as set construction, power tool, and working at heights, does this increase the risk from moderate to high?
So are they asking if there is administrative as well as higher? So if it's included in the classification hazard rating, so in film, say for example, film, they do have administrative, they have construction, they have they're all different occupations, but if they are listed in the hazard rating for the classification unit, then you would use the hazard rating that's listed in the classification unit. If not, that's when they would have to look into using a higher hazard rating. Or if it's a separate workplace that's not generally consistent with work described in the employer's classification unit and it poses a greater risk, that's when a different hazard rating should be used.
If it's not practicable to conduct a drill within 365 days, what else can be done to still meet the requirements of the legislation?
I can get back to you on that. I'm just going to write down the question.
Hey, can a production's occupational health and safety program incorporate details / answer questions on who the key players are designated as for running / documenting / evaluating the drills and for signing off on the first aid assessments?
Sorry, Marett, could you repeat that question?
Yeah. Can a production's occupational health and safety program incorporate details / answer questions on who key players are designated as for running / documenting / evaluating drills and for signing off on first aid assessments?
Yes, the program could include that information, as long as the Joint Health and Safety Committee are aware. And of course, I'm assuming with the program, they're also aware, they're going to be involved with the program as well. So yes, that as long as it's documented.
Yeah. Somebody wants to know, do work sites need potable water?
It would depend on the remoteness and the situation.
I believe, Deesha, that I read in the guidelines that that this is based on your first aid assessment, that it's you're working in cold temperatures, you need to have warm water, and same if it's
Oh, okay. The temperature of water, is that what it's referring to?
well, but they just say potable water.
Okay. We don't, okay, I'm not, sorry, potable water?
Yeah, that's what that was the question.
I can look into that. I do have information about reasonable temperature for water where, I mean, if you keep water in a running car, where would the heating aspect of it? But I can look into this for you as well.
Okay. Will you have a template or example of what a first aid drill should look like include available by November 1st? And I can answer this. Actsafe is developing a resource for drill. So you'll be able to, it's not going to be an example of what a first aid drill is, but it's going to be all the things that should be happening in the drill and the documentation for that. Somebody asked, does there need to be a designated first aid attendant from on site from opening to close of work site?
Yes, that is correct. You would need from open to close. You would need a first aid attendant at all times.
Okay. A shooting crew is shooting up on Seymour Mountain. Road is gravel, steep, and requires either an ATV or four-wheel truck to transport crew to and from base camp to shoot location. Drive is slow and takes approximately 10 minutes. Production has a first aid attendant with a jump kit at a satellite station with no first aid room, mostly focused on food and water. Production has crew up there for 8 hours and then is moving to a new location on Seymour. Productions will usually forego a more robust first aid setup in these types of situations. Will this be considered passable by WorkSafeBC under the new regulations?
Is the question asking it's going from less accessible to more accessible?
No, I think they're just asking if I think probably this question is stating that like there's no first aid room when they probably should be having a first aid room. And will WorkSafeBC come on site and say this is not possible because you need to be having a first aid room? That I believe that's what the question's asking.
Well, if the procedures did change and if the assessment is different, then yes, you would have to go with the requirements.
Yeah. Also, potable water, just there was clarification on that potable water question. It's drinkable and can be digested. Like I say.
Okay, and it's more to do with temperature, is that correct?
That's what I remember the regulations talking about, temperature as opposed to drinkable.
I actually have some information about that. I'm just going to drop that into the chat right now.
Somebody else wants to know, do you need hot and cold potable water at the dressing station? And do you need a first aid attendant present during coffee breaks and lunch breaks?
I can also put that into the chat. Sorry, just looking for the potable water.
And somebody wants to know, as a primary contractor, do they have to have first aid attendants on site to cover third-party vendors?
So multi-employer sites, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes, they would. And there is information in the guidelines about multi-employers as well. And I can go ahead and put that into the chat right now as well.
Okay, so our unfortunately our meeting, because this was booked till 2:30, we will be logging off in a minute. So I will just this concludes our question and answer period. Thank you so much, Deesha.
No problem. Thank you.
So these are the resources. They will be sent to you by email, along with a recording of this presentation. So yeah, the next steps will be the recording of the webinar and the list of resources. And we would love to get your evaluation on this. This is a QR code that you can scan with your phones. It really helps us determining how you felt about the webinar, if you felt that your needs were addressed here, or if you want to see anything else, we would appreciate that. So I'll give you a moment to scan that.
And also, Marett, if anyone does have any questions, you can reach me directly. I'll put my email address in the webinar chat as well.
Thank you. And you can also reach out to us at Actsafe, as I said, if you need help with your first aid assessments, your first aid drills, or you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us here. We are at Actsafe, we are here to service you, our stakeholders.